Imagine being cast out by your own daughter, not for betrayal, not for crime, but for being an extra mouth to feed. One night, you're a grieving widow holding on to the last thread of family, and the next you're standing in the cold with nothing but 2 suitcases and a hollow heart. But life doesn't always end in silence. Sometimes, silence sharpens into a blade. What if the very building you were thrown out of became your signed, sealed, and paid in full? What if the people who erased you suddenly had to beg at your door? This isn't just a story of revenge, it's a story of survival, dignity, and the kind of justice that makes the guilty choke on their own choices. Stay with me, because this is the reckoning they never saw coming. Subscribe now to Silent Lies You Won't Forget This. I learned how a heart can make no sound when it splits in two. It happened at a small dining table with a sweating glass of beer leaving a ring on the wood and the smell of chicken pot pie curling through the air like a memory that refused to die. I had cooked it because I still believed ritual could hold a house together. My daughter scrolled on her phone, face lit by a pale glow that made her look younger than she felt to me, farther away, unreachable. Her husband lifted the beer and watched me the way a landlord watches a clock. I asked about their day. He did not answer.
Amanda,
the television
please.
droned from the other room with a sports highlight I could not name. I cut the pie,
Look at me.
placed a slice on his plate, on hers, and waited for the small flicker of gratitude that used to pass between mother and child without words. It did not come. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He folded his words like paper cuts. Perhaps it is time we stop pretending this is temporary, he said. We are not a charity. My fork touched the plate. I felt my name leave my body and hover near the ceiling, a small ghost searching for a way back home.
Amanda.
I asked what he meant, though I already knew.
Amanda.
He told me about bills, about contributions,
Maybe it is
about the
best.
weight of groceries and utilities, and then he chose a phrase that rang in my ears like a slammed door. We did not sign up for an extra mouth to feed. He kept eating while I tried to swallow air. I turned to my daughter for the saving look that can break a spell. She would not lift her eyes. She said something about stability, about how maybe it would be best for everyone if I found something else. Just for a while, just until things evened out. That word everyone rolled across the table and landed in my lap like a stone. I have been many things in my life, but I had never been a burden until that syllable told me I was. I did not argue. There are moments when dignity is a glass bird. Raise your voice and it shatters. I stood, set my napkin down, and walked to the narrow bedroom where I had lined my shoes in a tidy row like a prayer for order. I filled 2 suitcases with the last pieces of a life I had spent decades building for other people. A sweater that still carried my late husband's cologne in the stitching. The photograph of a backyard birthday where my daughter wore a
Freeloader.
paper crown and frosting on her nose. A jar of buttons I had never needed but always kept, because a mother believes everything can be mended with the right small part. I left the furniture. I left the pot pie. I left my hope folded inside a dish towel like a letter I could not send. The hallway was longer than I remembered. No one followed me. No one said wait. I closed the door on the word mother and carried my suitcases into the night. The wind cut through my coat. I sat on the curb and listened to the building breathe. Windows glowed like indifferent eyes. My phone was dead, as if the battery could not bear witness either. I waited for a taxi that did not come, and for the ache to become anger. It did not. It was only a hollow drum that kept beating out the same question. What had I done to become unwanted in a house I would have burned my hands to save? I found a motel with a clerk who did not look up, and a vending machine that clattered false hope when the dollar went in. The wallpaper peeled in damp corners like old secrets. The carpet smelled of storms that had dried halfway. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling stain in the shape of a bird flying away. The first tears were quiet, the kind that do not leave the body, only rearrange the bones. In the morning I wrote to my daughter, I understand. I love you always. When there was no response, I wrote again, shorter, careful, as if my words had weight that could tip her life the wrong way. Weeks stretched thin. I learned the precise silence of a phone that will not light up. I applied for jobs that wanted younger backs and newer
I
histories.
understand.
The interviews were polite, until they were not. I told myself
you
I would clean
always.
houses, watch children, answer phones, anything to make the days stack up into something worth standing on. My body moved like a clock that had been wound too tight for too long. At night, I spoke to my husband in the dark. I told him about the way the light fell across the motel desk at 4 in the afternoon, and how the ice machine coughed like an old man near dawn. I told him I had been brave at the table. I did not tell him how small I felt on the curb, Some truths are too thin to carry safely. On the fourth day, I sent a message that was only a heart. It is strange to learn that love can live in such a small symbol and still be too heavy to deliver. The message slipped into the void and did not come back. I tried to fill the empty hours with useful acts. I bought a notebook and made lists that looked like ladders: groceries, applications, laundromat hours. I walked to a thrift store and held a set of chipped porcelain cups that reminded me of morning sun on a kitchen table that no longer existed. I put them back carefully as if someone else needed that memory more. One evening, when the unanswered messages had formed their own kind of calendar on my phone, I opened a dusty box that I had grabbed in a panic on my way out. The last box I had not yet dared to touch. Inside were photographs curled at the edges, a handful of letters, a small silver brooch shaped like a leaf, and at the very bottom, a book bound in worn leather, soft as old skin. I knew it before I turned it over. My mother had once kept it in a drawer and warned me not to peek. The motel lamp flickered when I plugged it in. I sat on the bed, crossed my legs, and opened the first page. Her handwriting was neat and looped, a discipline that outlived the budget notes and grocery complaints that filled the early entries. I read about rain and choir practice, about the price of flour and the way the laundry lines snapped in the wind. The ordinary held my hands steady. Then the entries shifted. He came again today. He wishes things were different. He has a name to protect. Margaret will never know. The air in the room thinned. The vending machine outside the door hummed like a warning. I turned pages that trembled and found initials that might as well have been a confession. Promises made in hotel rooms where blinds were kept half closed. A lawyer's name. A trust whispered like a prayer. I read until the words bled into one another, and then I closed the book and pressed it to my chest because I understood that I had been traveling through a tunnel and that there was a light I had not known to look for. I slept without sleeping, eyes open, heart awake, feeling something I had not felt since before grief taught me to count the ways silence can hurt. It was not triumph. It was not even hope. It was the thought that pain might be a door. In the morning, I sat at the small desk and wrote a letter in long, careful strokes to the lawyer my mother had named. I told him who I was and who she had been when the world pressed her into corners. I did not ask for anything. I asked for a conversation. I folded the pages, sealed the envelope, and walked it to the mailbox as if I were carrying a newborn bird. The days that followed blurred like watercolor left in the rain. I learned the route to the library computers, the price of coffee that tastes like burnt coins, the sound of a message that does not arrive. But beneath the surface, something straightened in me. My shoulders found their line. My gaze stopped apologizing. I stood a little taller when I passed mirrors, not because I loved what I saw, but because I decided to be seen. When the phone finally rang, and an old voice said my mother's name the way a man speaks of a photograph he has kept for too long, I knew the tunnel had an end. I did not know where it led yet. I only knew that I would walk it to the last step, with my 2 suitcases stacked beside the door like sentries, and the glass bird of my dignity whole for the first time in months, hidden but unbroken, waiting for its sky. I did not expect salvation to come bound in leather, pressed with the fingerprints of a woman who once hid her love in the margins of a diary. The night I opened those pages, the motel walls leaned closer as if they wanted to hear the confession too. I read until dawn, until the words blurred, until the silence of my mother's voice finally spoke through ink. She had carried a secret not meant for me, a secret with initials that carved themselves into my mind. HJS. He came again today, she wrote. He has a family, a name, but he wished he could give me more. Margaret must never know. My name, written by the woman who raised me. And yet I felt I had never truly belonged to her world until that moment. The entries were a map of hidden meetings, whispered promises. Payments slipped like shame between lovers who could not share a roof. My mother wrote of longing and regret, of the ache of living in shadow. Then came the promise that jolted me awake. If anything ever happened, arrangements were in place. A trust, a letter, a lawyer, Goldstein. I clutched the diary and whispered the name as if I might summon him from the paper itself. It took me days to gather the courage. I sat at the library computer, the glow of the screen reflecting off the glass that separated me from the world. My fingers hovered over the keys. What if it was a dead end? What if I was chasing ghosts? Still, I searched. Leonard Goldstein, retired estate lawyer, Dallas. My heart raced as I scribbled the address on a scrap of motel stationery. I could not call. My voice would tremble. My shame would spill through the receiver. Instead, I wrote a letter. each word carved carefully like stepping stones across a river. I am Margaret, daughter of Eleanor. She wrote your name. I beg only for a conversation. I sealed it with hands that shook and prayed to a God I was not sure listened anymore. 2 weeks later, the phone rang. The voice was old, cracked with years, but it softened when I spoke my mother's name. I always wondered if you'd find me, he said. There is something you must see.
Let's see how he likes
I
it.
packed my suitcase before sunrise, as if fear might catch me if I lingered. The bus ride to Dallas was a blur of passing fields and hollow stations. I pressed my forehead against the glass and watched strangers step off into lives that waited for them. I had no life waiting. I had only questions. The law office was small, quiet, lined with books that smelled of dust and memory. Leonard Goldstein greeted me with eyes that had already read my story. He handed me an envelope sealed in time. I traced the name written on it before I opened it. To my daughter, Margaret Louise. The words inside undid me. He confessed the affair, the silence, the cowardice of a man bound by reputation. But then came the truth that changed everything. In death, he would do what he had not in life. He left me a portion of his assets entrusted to Mr. Goldstein. Bank accounts, investments, titles all mine. More than $1 million, enough to change the shape of my world. I should have laughed, or screamed, or cursed him for his absence. Instead, I sat in silence as tears blurred the ink. For the first time in months, I felt chosen, seen, not erased, not discarded, but written into history by blood. That night back in the motel, I did not sleep. I stared at the ceiling, the same cracked paint that had mocked me in my grief, and felt the corners of my mouth lift into something unfamiliar. A smile. They thought they had ended me. They thought I was powerless. But they had no idea what I now carried inside me. I lingered in Dallas, walking streets I did not know, sipping coffee in quiet cafes, breathing like a woman who had been pulled from water just before she drowned. For the first time in years, envy slipped away. I did not crave what others had. I studied them instead. I wondered which faces hid betrayal, which smiles were stitched over wounds, and I realized I was no longer one of them. I was something else now. When I returned to Austin, I did not crawl back to the motel. I rented a small apartment downtown, one with clean walls and a lock that answered only to me. I dressed differently. Nothing flashy, but sharp enough to make people look twice. I walked with a new rhythm, like I had a secret no one could touch. Because I did. I watched videos, read books, studied contracts late into the night. I learned the language of power, of business, of real estate. Not to build an empire, but to build armor.
Nice to meet you.
I would never be
Thank
small
you for
again.
coming.
That was when I
So glad
saw
you
it.
could make it.
An auction listing buried online, a distressed property, taxes unpaid, an apartment building in East Austin. My pulse thundered when I read the address. The very building where Amanda and Chad lived. I closed the laptop, then opened it again, unable to believe fate had placed such a weapon in my hands. The auction was 2 weeks away. I contacted Mr. Goldstein. We created an LLC, a shell that wore no name but mine in secret. ML Holdings, Margaret Louise. When the auction came, I placed the bid without hesitation. And when I won, it was with a silence so
Margaret, these are the
profound it
latest
felt
tenant
holy.
complaints.
I held the
Thank
deed in
you.
my
I will
hands
look
and
into
whispered
it.
to myself, let us see how he likes paying rent to the mouth he could not feed. I signed the papers in a room so quiet I could hear the ink drying. The deed slid across the desk like a small, heavy truth, and I carried it out into the bright Austin morning the way one carries a newborn thought that will change a life. Ownership is such a simple word until it begins to breathe. I went home, placed the folder on my kitchen table, and ran my palm over the cover until
I
my
miss you.
fingerprints warmed the cardboard. I had not raised my voice. I had not begged. I had learned the language of power and spoken it in perfect silence. The first act was administrative, and yet it felt like theater. Notification letters, neatly printed and numbered, addressed to every tenant. Rents would be reassessed, leases reviewed, market rates enforced. For one unit, the number was not double. It was triple. It was not revenge, I told myself. It was gravity. Things fall when you let go. I had been the one falling. Now I was the one who controlled the ground. The letters went out on a Monday. By Wednesday, the storm I had forecast began to gather. My phone lit with a voicemail from a number I knew by muscle memory. Hi, Mom. Something weird happened. Our rent just... I let it go to voicemail, the way I had let so many of my own messages fall into nothing. Her voice shook around the edges of my name. For a long moment, I stood in my living room holding the phone like it was a hot coal I could not drop. Then I set it face down and watched the screen darken. That night, I drove by their building and parked under a tree I used to recognize by the way it scraped the roof during storms. Their windows were rectangles of pale light. A shadow crossed the curtains, tall, agitated, puncturing the stillness with gestures I could feel more than see. Another shadow paced, smaller, wrists drawn to the center. A woman trying to make herself into less space. I did not get out of the car. I did not press my face to the glass. I simply watched until the engine hummed me back to myself and I drove away. I wanted to feel triumphant. I felt mostly hollow, as if justice had a wind whistling through it. The work began before sunrise. I met with the manager and the contractor and spoke about leaks, locks, and lights, as if I had discussed such things all my life. A broken door on the third floor, flicker in the stairwell, mailboxes that stuck and swallowed keys. This was not about Chad. This was about the building, about 97 people who would benefit from the order I was restoring. The irony was not lost on me that his anger would pave new hallways and brighten the bulbs that kept neighbors safe. I changed the signage. It was nothing dramatic, only clean letters on brushed metal. ML Holdings. No one would know what it stood for. I knew. It steadied me, the way a locket steadies a widow who has learned how to walk again. A security camera went up near the lobby. Another at the back where the parking lot opened toward the alley. Legal, routine, visible enough to calm, discreet enough not to threaten. Policy letters followed. Annual inspections, mandatory and scheduled. The property manager forwarded me the first blast of objections, one name in all caps. I read them without flinching. Please respond using Clause C regarding market rate adjustments, I wrote back. No special exceptions. I began to dress like a woman whose time had a price. A charcoal blazer, not new, but fitted. Shoes that made a sound of decision when they crossed tile. My hair in a sleek knot, then in soft waves, learning which version of my face passed through doors unnoticed. I attended a small business meetup under a name that belonged to my initials but not to my history. I listened more than I spoke. Questions about financing and repair timelines landed in my ears and left through my pen. Every connection was a rung. Every rung was a height from which the past grew smaller. Days folded into one another. Work orders came and went. Payments cleared. A calm rhythm took root. The bank account for the LLC ticked upward and I felt a curious quiet in my chest. The kind that arrives when you stop bracing for impact. Only one tenant made noise, and he made enough for a building. Notes slid under the office door about water pressure, trash, injustice, robbery. The property manager logged each one and answered none beyond policy. I did not need to read his words to hear his voice. I had heard it at the dinner table, slicing my dignity into rationed pieces. Amanda began leaving messages that were smaller than words. Hi, Mom. Can we talk? I really need you. Then silence. I let each one rest in the dark like seeds I refused to water. When the doubt clawed at me, I opened my mother's diary and traced the lines that once tried to hide me from myself. Margaret will never know. That sentence used to make me ache. Now it made me stand taller. I knew, and knowledge had become armor. One morning I stepped out of a tenant meeting and nearly collided with the past. He passed me in the parking lot, shoulders thrown forward like a challenge looking for a new wall. He did not recognize me. The sunglasses helped, so did the posture. Amanda trailed a step behind him, her gaze on the ground. I held a folder against my side and kept walking. The air seemed to thicken with what he did not see. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it crosses your path and leaves you feeling cold without understanding why. The building responded to care the way people do. A fresh coat of paint gathered the hallways into a single, calmer breath. New lighting removed the dim corners where fear likes to sit. The maintenance team sent photos to document progress. In one, I saw the edge of Amanda's doormat, frayed and curling. A small curl of blue fabric caught beneath it like a dropped ribbon. I stared too long at that corner of a life and forced myself to look away. The second wave of notices went out. Inspection dates, updated lease terms, the schedule for landscaping improvements. The property manager told me that one unit had returned a letter folded into a crude threat. The paper bore the imprint of a hand that pressed too hard when it wrote. I recognized the energy, if not the handwriting. I felt fear try to rise and then settle.
Freeloader!
We added a patrol. We documented. We followed the map that grown women follow when a man begins to panic. The truth is that part of me grieved in parallel with the work. I mourned the version of my daughter that would have reached for my hand at the first sign of discomfort. I mourned the version of me that believed love could outvote cruelty. Yet grief did not run the building. I did. Each small improvement became a metronome for my resolve. Tick for the leak in the third-floor bathroom repaired. Tick for the lobby door rehung on a stronger hinge. Tick for the light in the stairwell that no longer flickered. Tick for the inbox where his name appeared less often now that answers no longer fed him. At night I brewed tea and stood on my balcony watching the city breathe. My apartment overlooked a courtyard that belonged to a different building, a safer neighborhood with windows that looked like quiet promises. I did not watch them often. I did not need to. The point was never to haunt their shadows. The point was to own my daylight. The calls from Amanda changed cadence. They became soft voicemails that tried not to cry. I replayed one and paused on the inhale before she spoke. The sound of a girl who once believed I could fix anything and now did not know if I would. I held the phone, then set it down and smoothed the page of a ledger where numbers behaved better than people. Love asks for immediacy. Respect sometimes requires a delay. Weeks later, the quarterly report arrived with photographs and tidy columns. Most units were steady, a few late, one consistently agitated. The bathroom in their apartment showed mildew and a cracked tile near the sink. The kitchen counter had a spiderweb fracture that ran toward the edge and then stopped, as if it had thought better of it. Mail lay in a small drift under the slot. It is a particular kind of pain to look at signs of neglect in a home where your child wakes and sleeps. I let the pain say what it needed, and then I filed the report and approved a round of common area upgrades. I had become a woman who carried two truths at once. My heart ached for my daughter. My mind refused to rescue her from a cage she had chosen. Power is not the loudest voice in the room. It is the hand that does not shake when it signs. It is the policy that does not bend for threats. It is the knowledge that consequences are not cruelty, they are clarity. I would not topple the life she stood in. I would tighten the screws on the frame that held it until she felt what I had felt the night I was asked to leave. The point where silence turns into decision. When I turned off the lamp and the apartment settled around me, I felt the strangest peace. I was no longer the woman on a curb with a dead phone and a colder sky. I was the woman who had learned how to move in the world with a quiet that made doors open and bullies shrink. The next move would come when it was ready. I would not push it. Gravity would do what it does. And I would be there, steady, when the fall finally stopped. I understood then that silence could be shaped into a blade and also into a bridge, and that I would have to decide which one to carry into the room. For 3 weeks after the new notices went out, the building breathed in short, sharp inhales. Work orders multiplied and then dwindled, as if the tenants themselves were testing whether the ground had truly shifted. My staff sent me photos of repaired hinges and relit corridors. The emails were orderly, time-stamped, calm. Only one current pulsed hot beneath the surface, and it came from the unit whose name I no longer said out loud. I read each complaint, each veiled threat, each all-caps subject line, and I refused to be pulled into the noise. A policy is a backbone. A backbone does not argue. It stands. I saw Amanda at the grocery store and almost called her name. She stood in the fluorescent wash of the dry goods aisle, head bent over a list, fingers hovering above a box of macaroni and cheese she would eventually set back on the shelf. She looked tired in a way no sleep cures, a kind of tired that is the result of carrying someone else's temper in your mouth for too long. I stepped behind a display and watched long enough to remind myself that pity is a poor architect. Then I left before my resolve softened into rescue. The anonymous letter arrived pressed into an envelope with no return address, the script heavy and slanted, the words an attempt at intimidation that smelled of fear. I held it over the sink and read it once. I recognized the pressure of the pen, the way anger digs grooves into paper when it cannot find softer ground. I filed it, documented it, and turned off the faucet. I added 2 cameras to the plan and asked the manager to schedule a community meeting, the kind that brings out the curious, the resentful, and the hopeful in equal measure. We chose a Tuesday evening, a neutral hour that leaves no one an excuse. The day of the meeting I arrived early. I walked the common room with the manager and checked the projector, the stack of handouts, the folding chairs lined in careful rows. There was a scent of new paint and recent vacuuming, that small domestic pride a building feels when someone has tended to it. I wore a charcoal blazer and dark jeans, hair loose around my shoulders in soft waves that disguised me from the version of me who had begged at a kitchen table. When I looked in the small, warped mirror by the exit, I saw a woman whose face belonged to her decisions. tenants trickled in. I recognized a nurse who always waved at the security camera, and a young man who walked dogs so faithfully that the pets stopped pulling at the leash when they neared his hands. They sat with arms crossed, with notepads open, with expectation or boredom or gratitude. I sat near the back and kept my gaze forward. I had not come to perform a victory. I had come to show the roof I was willing to hold. He entered like a weather front, Amanda half a step behind, his jaw set, his eyes scanning, searching for a target he had not yet named. He did not look at me. He looked at the manager and planted himself in the first row, as if proximity could push a meeting off its rails. Amanda folded herself into the chair beside him and looked down at her hands. The room settled into a hush that felt like a stage taking a breath. The presentation began with ordinary things: maintenance updates, landscaping schedules, a timeline for insulation work that would lower utility costs for everyone by winter, a slide about security, about the cameras installed to protect, not to pry. The murmur of questions rose and fell. A woman asked about recycling. A man asked about parking. The manager answered with the ease of a person who has memorized the shape of 100 daily problems and how to solve them. Then the manager paused, looked toward the back where I sat, and said the sentence we had rehearsed twice and I had rehearsed alone 100 times. We would like to thank ML Holdings for its commitment to the property. The owner is present and is available for questions after the updates. The room turned, chairs creaked. The word owner hung in the air like a chandelier that had always been there, waiting for the lights to be switched on. I stood. The distance from my chair to the front of the room was not long, but each step felt like a small history unspooling and dropping cleanly behind me. I reached the manager's side and faced the tenants. "Good evening," I said. "My name is Margaret. I am the owner of this building." The room went so quiet that even the projector fan seemed to hold its breath. His chair scraped back. "You," it came out of him like a bark that did not know if it wanted to be a laugh. "You must be joking. What kind of stunt is this?" I looked at him, really looked, and saw the swollen pride, the sleeplessness, the panic that had been eating its own tail.
Perfect.
"No stunt," I said. "Just business. Market rates. Upgrades you can already see. A building that deserves what it was denied." He stepped forward, a half step too close, the way a man tests whether a boundary is made of paint or steel. "You manipulated this. You targeted us. You raised our rent to break us." The room sensed the heat and tilted away from it. I did not. I held his eyes until I felt the old tremor in my hands consider returning, and then I breathed until it left. "I treated every tenant equally," I said. I did not forget.
Hello, it's Amanda.
I turned my body back to the room and away from him, because that was part of the choice, too. The bully is a gravitational pull. The only way to defeat it is to orient yourself toward the people who are not trying to swallow the light. If there are questions about the schedule or the repairs, I will answer them now. Thank you for your patience with the noise and dust. We are nearly there. Questions came in a trickle and then a stream. What about the laundry room hours? Would the new insulation affect the upstairs vents? Could the playground gate get a child-proof latch? I answered each one with notes and dates, and a promise that fit inside the borders of reality. The room softened. The room began to see me not as a specter of upheaval, but as a woman who paid attention. He waited at the edge of the crowd like a storm that refuses to spend itself. When the last neighbor moved away, he closed the distance, anger carefully leashed now that an audience had thinned. "You think you won," he said under his breath. "You have made an enemy." I let the words stand between us like a mirror, and then I stepped aside so they reflected only him. "I did not make anything," I said. "You did, the day you taught my daughter to measure love in rent and groceries." Amanda moved between us. "Chad, stop." The word hung strange in her mouth, unsure at first, and then it found its weight. "Stop." He turned to her, disbelief a second skin. "What did you say?" She swallowed. She kept her eyes on me. "She is not your enemy," she said. "She never was." He stared at her as if a wall had grown where he expected a door. Amanda turned to me. "I did not know," she whispered. "About the ownership. About any of it. Why did you not tell me?" "Because you had to see it," I said, "not hear it. See it." She blinked hard and nodded once, like a person trying to anchor a boat finally reaching a dock. He made a sound that was almost laughter and almost a curse, and then backed away because there was nowhere left to go forward. Tenants drifted past us with small smiles and quick thanks, the way people do when they know they have watched something that mattered but are not sure yet how to name it. The manager began stacking chairs.
We need to talk
The
about this
projector shut
situation
down
now.
with a sigh. I felt my shoulders lower by a fraction I had not realized I was holding. Amanda stood very still. I could feel the electricity of a dozen unsaid sentences passing between us. I did not reach for her.
I
Not
understand
yet.
your concerns.
I had told myself I would wait until she proved she could live in a room where truth was the loudest thing. He left first, the door opening and closing behind him with more force than the hinge required. The echo faded. The common room grew ordinary again, a place where notices would be taped to a corkboard, and where children would color while their parents signed forms. I gathered the extra handouts and slid them into a folder. Amanda's breathing steadied. She looked at me the way a person looks at a landmark they had driven past 1,000 times without ever stopping. Thank you for coming, I said, because sometimes the smallest sentence is the only bridge you can safely lower. She nodded, eyes bright and careful. I do not know how to fix it, she said. I said nothing because answers can be a kind of theft. She would have to find hers the way I had found mine, on days when courage is a staircase you climb without anyone watching. We walked to the door together. The hallway lights hummed. Somewhere outside, a car alarm chirped twice and fell silent. At the threshold, she paused and looked as if she wanted to step forward, and as if stepping forward might burn her feet. I opened the door and let the night air in. It smelled like fresh paint cooling and a season changing. I did not hug her. I did not promise anything I could not guarantee. I held the door and let her choose. She stepped into the dark and turned left, toward a future that would not announce itself but would arrive all the same. I watched until the corner swallowed her, and then I closed the door, flipped off the light, and walked back across a room I now owned entirely. Not just in deed, but in the quiet that followed a truth finally spoken aloud. After the meeting, the building felt newly aligned, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. The next morning, my inbox held two kinds of messages. Tenants asked practical questions about vents and laundry cards, the kinds of details that make a place livable. And then there was the other thread, the one braided from indignation and fear, sent from a familiar unit that typed in bursts like a man pacing while he wrote. I answered the first group with times, dates, and receipts. I forwarded the second to my attorney with a subject line that contained only the unit number and the words for record. The week grew heavy and strange. The manager reported that he had stormed down twice to demand the legal name behind the company, only to be shown the same paper trail he'd already seen. He dug anyway. He called the title office and pretended to be a lawyer. He sent clumsy phishing messages to the property account asking for a face to attach to his anger. Each attempt left a trace that made our file thicker and my resolve thinner and sharper at the same time. There is a moment when you realize a man is not looking for answers. He is searching for a place to put his rage. That place had always been my shoulders. That place was closed. The notice about scheduled inspections went out. We posted it in the lobby and slipped copies under doors. He filled the portal with objections and italics and threats about extortion. I did not argue. A policy is a spine. You do not debate with a spine. You stand on it. Amanda did not call. For days she did not call. Then one night the rain started in long silver ropes and did not stop. The intercom buzzed, and her voice arrived in pieces. I was downstairs before the second buzz ended. When I opened the door, she stood with a paper bag clutched to her chest, as if it were the only barrier keeping her upright. Water ran from her hair into the collar of her shirt. I gave her a towel and guided her inside. She sat on the edge of the couch like a guest who intends to apologize and leave without accepting tea. I poured tea anyway and placed the cup where her hands could find it. He is not who I told myself he was, she said, and the words came out flat with exhaustion. I let the sentence rest. She spoke about the way suspicion had colonized their days, the phone checks, the questions, the sudden arrivals at her job as if surveillance could be mistaken for devotion. He thinks we are being targeted, she said. He thinks someone is behind everything. He thinks it is you. She searched my face as if she wanted me to flinch. I did not. Fear had visited me for months and found no bed left to sleep in. I told him I did not know where you were, she said, and then she closed her eyes. That was a lie. I found your name on a notice from the management company. I did not say anything because I did not know what to do with the part of me that was relieved and the part of me that was ashamed. She looked around my small living room where nothing was elaborate and everything was clean. You created a life without me, she whispered. The sentence was not an accusation. It was an inventory. I answered it with silence because there are certain truths that shrink when explained. We spoke like people who had to relearn a language they had once been fluent in. She asked small questions about the improvements and larger questions she did not name about love and loyalty and how a door becomes a wall. I did not offer absolution. I offered a chair, a dry towel, and presence that did not step closer than she could bear. When she stood to leave, she reached as if to hug me, then stopped, then stepped forward anyway and folded herself around me like a woman trying to remember the shape of safety. I returned the embrace cautiously at first, and then with a steadiness that surprised me. She pulled back, eyes shining and disciplined, and left the towel neatly folded on the arm of the couch as if that could balance some ledger. After she left, the building changed again. He began leaving notes at the office door, written with a hand that pressed hard enough to score the paper beneath. He hovered in hallways.
You are welcome.
He glared at cameras as if lenses could be intimidated. We increased the frequency of patrols and checked locks twice. The manager documented everything. I kept my world uncluttered, and my calendar full of small acts that added up to order. I slept through the night for the first time in weeks. The email arrived 3 days later with a subject line that demanded urgency. The body was a tangle of threats and insinuations. He claimed he knew about the inheritance. He claimed the press would find the old scandal. He claimed he would make noise so loud it would swallow the roof I had built over my own head. I read it once and felt the old tremor breathe against my wrists. Then I forwarded it to my attorney. The response went out within hours, as neat and final as a door that closes and locks in one motion. It cited the defamation statutes and attached exhibits of his previous messages, tenant complaints, and the call notes recorded by our staff. It offered a choice I had long ago learned to honor: cease and desist or proceed and lose. 2 days later, Amanda called, not in panic but in a voice that had run out of space to be afraid. He left, she said. He packed a bag and disappeared for the night after I told him he could not search my phone again. He left a note about being hunted. I heard the paper tear in her breath. You did not ruin his life, I said softly. He did. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, I am sorry for mistaking my silence for peace. The social media rants followed like smoke, vague and theatrical, never naming names now that naming had a legal price.
I am so sorry.
We logged them. Eventually they dwindled into mutterings that only the lonely hear. He was still dangerous in the way a cornered animal is dangerous, but he was no longer unpredictable. Predictability is control's worst enemy. Amanda began to change in ways that carried sound. She moved out of the unit and into a studio that smelled of primer and new beginnings. She started therapy on Tuesday afternoons, the hour she used to reserve for managing someone else's temper. She went to a community art class on Thursdays. She bought paints the color of late summer and winter dawn, and worked until the floor around her was flecked with proof that she had chosen to make something rather than hold herself together by force. She brought me a Paintinga Phoenix that did not soar so much as burn steady, and asked if I would hang it. I placed it above the fireplace and felt the room take a deeper breath. When the quarterly report arrived, it was clean. Occupancy stabilized, work orders down, utility costs trending lower as the insulation did its quiet work. The profit line behaved like a nerve that had stopped being irritated. There was a recommendation in the final paragraph that I had anticipated and refused to stare at, the way one avoids looking straight at the sun. It is an advantageous market for asset disposition, the manager wrote. Consider inquiries. I closed the file and placed my palms flat on the table. Ownership had taught me that power is knowing when to hold and when to set down. Amanda visited on a Sunday afternoon with a book wrapped in a dish towel like something fragile from a kitchen drawer. When she unfolded the cloth, my mother's diary lay between us. I left it last time, she said. I read it. I saw who you came from and who you had to become when no one chose you out loud. Why did you not tell me sooner? I told her the truth. Because I did not know how to hand you a secret without handing you its weight. Because I needed you to walk to me, not because your rent tripled or your husband shouted, but because you remembered who you are. Her hands stopped shaking. Her shoulders dropped a fraction, the way a traveler settles under a pack only to realize it is finally empty. The building was quiet that night. The courtyard lights hummed. In a nearby unit, a child laughed, and then the laughter ran down the hall like water. I stood by the window and watched my own reflection soften into something I could admit was peace. Power had not made me louder. It had made me exact. I used it to repair, to protect, to hold a line that would not bend for threats or nostalgia. There were decisions still ahead, signatures to consider, a future that would need a new shape. But the storm that once lived in my stomach had moved on. What remained was a sky the color of steel at dusk, unbreakable and calm. I picked up a pen and began a list, not of grievances and not of repairs, but of promises I could keep to myself. I would not answer rage with rage. I would not confuse pity with love. I would not forget the curb where I sat with 2 suitcases and a dead phone. Because the woman on that curb was the one who learned how to stand. I wrote until the words felt like a scaffold, and then I set the pen down and went to bed. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, the house was warm. The envelope arrived on a morning so bright it almost felt disrespectful. I slid it open with a butter knife and unfolded the letter at my kitchen table, the same place where I had learned to sign my name in a new alphabet of power. Congratulations, it read in careful legal prose. Transfer complete. Agreements executed. Action against Mr. Harmon resolved in your favor. You are free to sell, hold, or restructure as you see fit. I pressed the paper flat with both palms and felt the tremor that used to belong to fear return as something else entirely. There is a quiet that follows survival. It does not make a sound. It changes the pressure in the room. I did not cheer. I did not call anyone. I brewed tea and stared at the steam as if I could read a future in it. There had been a time when every day required endurance, when my spine was a bridge others walked across. Now the choice was mine. Keep the building and become the custodian of 100 small needs, or close the chapter and open a door I had spent months building without knowing its final shape. I set the cup down untouched and dialed a number that had become shorthand for a life I would not apologize for. I am ready, I told the realtor. She understood the kind of ready that takes months to pronounce. The listing went out modestly. No fanfare, no boasting. The improvements spoke for themselves. Offers arrived like birds on a wire, one after another until the wire hummed. I read them in order, not because I had to, but because order had rescued me. I chose the buyer whose commitment looked like stewardship and not hunger. We set a date. I signed the stack of papers in an office that smelled of lemon oil and ink. The pen clicked. The handshake was firm. The deed passed from my hands without taking any of my strength with it. The wire came through the next day. I watched the numbers settle into my account like a lake accepting rain, and then I did what grief had taught me to do when it tries to turn into pride. I went very still and listened for the truth beneath the noise. Half the money went to a shelter whose address I had memorized in case I ever needed it. I asked to remain anonymous, but to name the new wing after my mother, the Eleanor House. I wrote the check in deliberate strokes, the way one writes a benediction. The director cried over the phone. I did not. Perhaps because I finally felt something unclench in me that had been clenched for decades. A muscle that no anatomy book bothers to label. The other half I used to buy a small house back on the street where summer once tasted like hose water and scraped knees. A 2-bedroom with oak trees that hold the sky up, and a porch swing that learned my weight by the second afternoon. The windows faced east and took the sunrise like a promise. Amanda helped me move. She carried boxes in long, careful lines from the car to the living room, stacking them as if each one contained not plates and books but the years we had almost lost. We spoke in practical terms at first. This shelf or that one. Leave the rug rolled until the next rain passes. I watched her notice the place slowly, the way her eyes paused on the sink that gleamed without being asked, on the patch of sunlight that slid across the floor and climbed the wall like a child. She stopped at the fireplace. Above it hung the phoenix she had painted in reds that look almost black until the light touches them. She smiled the way a person smiles when a stranger recognizes them by their true name. We ate grilled cheese and tomato soup and burned one side and laughed like we had received permission from a kinder court. Chad became a ghost in the new quiet. There were murmurs online that never dared to say my name because the second letter from my attorney had sharpened the difference between insinuation and liability. Someone said he had moved 2 cities over to a job that did not ask many questions as long as he punched in on time. It did not matter. Men like that become a weather report you stop checking. The sky changes. You keep walking. Before he left, he signed what needed signing, a non-disclosure that folded his noise into silence and made it cost him to open his mouth. Amanda did not speak his name in my house. The rooms felt cleaner for it. The first week in the new place, I learned small rituals that make a home breathe in rhythm with you. I swept the porch at dusk. I trimmed a wayward branch that tapped the bedroom window like a restless thought. I planted 3 tomato starts in a raised bed and pushed their roots down with the same tenderness I had once used to lower my daughter into sleep. Mornings came with pale gold light and the sound of a neighbor's dog adjusting the leash to walk where it wanted. Evenings brought crickets bold enough to sing over the angle of my thoughts. I began to speak my husband's name in this house not as a lament but as a greeting. The diary lived on the mantel for a while, a reminder and a witness. I opened it one last time before placing it in a drawer where it would not have to defend itself anymore. I slipped a note between its final pages for Amanda to read when the right day arrived. You do not need their love to be worthy. You do not need their approval to be strong. You need the truth and a voice that belongs to you. It felt less like advice and more like a map I had drawn after walking every road twice. On a clear Tuesday, a city truck parked down the block and a worker painted a curb red with a steady hand. I watched him from the porch swing and felt that strange kind of satisfaction that comes when the world does what it is supposed to do without being told. Amanda joined me with 2 cups of tea and folded herself into the motion of the swing. We listened to the paint dry. I did not fill the air with talk. I wanted her to feel what I had taken so long to learn, that safety is a sound, and that it sounds like nothing taking from you what you did not offer. She told me about her therapist, about learning that loyalty is not love when it requires you to shrink. She spoke about art class, about the way pigment blooms in water and then settles into something you could not predict when the brush first touched the page. She said she was not sure who she was without the daily task of managing someone else's moods. I told her that emptiness is not the same as loneliness. Sometimes it is the shape that waits for what fits you. We did not hold hands. We did not need to. The swing carried us back and forth under a sky that had stopped demanding apologies. The letter from Mr. Goldstein arrived with a photograph enclosed. It showed my mother in a garden dress I had never seen, sunlight on her shoulders, a look that hovered somewhere between relief and resolve. On the back he had written, "She was kinder to herself on days she believed the future would forgive her." I placed the photograph on the mantel beside the diary and thanked a man across the years for keeping a promise to a girl who became my mother. Night came with a moon so bright it drew lines on the floorboards. I stood in that silver lattice and said the words I had been circling for months. I forgive you. Not my daughter, not my mother, not the man whose name had bank accounts attached to it. I said it to the woman who had sat on a curb with 2 suitcases and a dead phone and believed that she had been erased. I forgave her for almost forgetting that survival is not a personality. It is a season. It passes. It leaves rings in the wood that make the tree stronger. The house held the sentence and gave it back to me softer. I turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and felt the clean weight of a blanket that smelled like sun. Somewhere in the dark, a tomato stem lifted its small green face and decided to keep climbing. I slept as if sleep were a lake and not a fight. In the morning, I made coffee and opened the front door and stood barefoot on the threshold. The air smelled of cut grass and beginning. I did not need to win. I did not need to prove anything to anyone who had already refused to see me. I needed to live exactly here, exactly now, in the house I had chosen, under a sky that no longer required permission. Thank you for listening. I will tell them when I record this chapter. Subscribe, I will say, if you believe that silence can be a weapon and a refuge and, finally, a song. And somewhere, I hope,
Good evening,
a
everyone.
woman will hear me and understand that the moment she believes she has been erased is the same moment she begins to write herself into a future no one can take. There are moments in life when silence feels like defeat. When you are standing on a curb with 2 suitcases, a dead phone, and no one left to call. You believe the world has erased you. But sometimes silence is not the end. Sometimes it sharpens into a weapon. Sometimes it grows into armor.
hope you like it.
And sometimes silence becomes the loudest voice in the room. This story was never just about rent or revenge. It was about dignity. It was about a mother discarded like an unpaid bill, and the strength she found in secrets buried in a leather diary. It was about turning grief into fuel, humiliation into strategy, and betrayal into clarity. Every letter signed, every lock repaired, every policy enforced. These were not acts of vengeance. They were acts of reclamation. Amanda's journey matters too. She had to see the truth, not hear it. She had to walk into the storm, lose herself in the cage of control, and finally remember the mother who had stood by her side before fear rewrote her choices. Forgiveness did not come all at once. It came in whispers, in tea shared across a
I was
table,
never erased.
in the slow unlearning of silence that once protected her but no longer served her. And Chad? Men like him believe they own the narrative. They use intimidation, manipulation, and cruelty as currency. But in the end, he learned the truth that many bullies discover too late. You cannot choke someone who has already learned to breathe in silence. He became a ghost, swallowed not by Margaret's anger, but by his own hollow echoes. Margaret did not win because she was ruthless. She won because she refused to vanish, because she learned that power is not always loud, and justice does not always roar. Sometimes, justice is quiet. It walks into a meeting in a charcoal blazer, it answers threats with policy clauses, and it turns a building of walls into a foundation of freedom. If you are listening now, maybe you know what it means to be underestimated, discarded, silenced. Remember this: you are not erased. You are the spark they miscalculated. You are the storm they did not forecast. You are the silence that will outlast their noise. This is not just Margaret's story. It belongs to anyone who has been told they are too small, too weak,
Thank you for
too late.
listening.
To anyone who has been cast aside, only to rise and reclaim the ground beneath their feet. Thank you for listening. And if you believe in stories where silence speaks louder than screams, subscribe to Silent Lies. Because the next chapter might be yours,